Bueno, buenos días a todos. Primero que nada, gracias por aceptar esta invitación tan importante para el futuro de desarrollo de Puerto Rico. Hay una de las cosas que me ha sorprendido en este momento rápidamente cuando llegué al salón, y la verdad lo felicito porque es el sentido del humor. He tenido conversaciones con varias personas, estaba un poco medio tímido de qué tipo de ambiente íbamos a tener, y la verdad que sí, eso es sumamente importante, mirar estas situaciones con optimismo. Son realidades que tenemos que enfrentar y definitivamente somos nosotros los que podemos hacer una diferencia. Así que, sin duda alguna, para eso es que nos citamos aquí en el día de hoy, y espero que sea de gran provecho para todos, y un privilegio de tener a nuestros invitados especiales que van a compartir una hora y media con nosotros en el tema. Antes de empezar, sí me gustaría tocar varios puntos sobre la última convención junta ampliada de CEAL que se dio a cabo en Bolivia. Quiero compartir con ustedes la razón de ser de esta organización, es integrar a Puerto Rico dentro de la región de América Latina. Como saben, hay 3 juntas ampliadas al año muy importantes. En esta participaron sobre 19 países, usualmente participan 19, 21 países, y es una cumbre en donde se destilan y se dialogan temas sumamente importantes para el futuro desarrollo de la región. Acuérdense que CEAL mira a toda América Latina como una región, y esa es la misión que nosotros tenemos, de insertarnos en esa región para poder ser parte de la globalización dentro de la perspectiva de América Latina. Así que lo voy a llevar rápidamente por algunos puntos que creo que son sumamente interesantes para saber en el marco en la cual están las posibilidades de desarrollo o de inserción de Puerto Rico. Primero, el escenario internacional muestra, como todos ustedes saben, una disminución de actividad económica en Asia, Europa, y tan solo un frágil crecimiento en los Estados Unidos. Ellos están bien claros con este punto porque ahí es donde radica el mayor potencial de desarrollo de América Latina. Es como quien dicen, estar en el momento correcto, en los tiempos correctos, ¿no? En el lugar correcto. Así que todos estos países están mirando, inclusive Estados Unidos, Asia, Europa, hacia América Latina, como el próximo destino de mayor desarrollo en el mundo. ¿Okay? Y eso es algo que ellos tienen bien claro, y es algo que nosotros tenemos que tener claro, porque eso es parte de la inserción nuestra y buscar oportunidades dentro de ese ámbito de negocio. Por otro lado, América Latina crecerá entre un 1 y un 2% en el 2016. La disminución de precios de materia prima, los precios de la energía, presionarán a las economías de América Latina de una forma positiva. Como sabemos también, Brasil, Argentina y Venezuela se encuentran en una profunda reformulación de sus políticas y registrarán definitivamente un crecimiento negativo. Siendo unas potencias tan grandes como sobre todo ha sido Argentina y Brasil, y que América Latina siga pujante, significa que hay unos países que definitivamente son los pilares del desarrollo y crecimiento económico en la región. Las inversiones extranjeras en América Latina continúan siendo las más elevadas del mundo, para que tengan una perspectiva también qué es lo que está sucediendo en términos de toda la región. Unas partes son inversiones extranjeras directas que se están realizando, y otras son mergers and acquisitions. ¿Okay? Las inversiones internas oscilan entre un 15% del PIB en Brasil y un 25% del PIB en Perú. O sea que eso es significativo en lo que está sucediendo dentro de esos países, en esos países. Por otra parte, hemos observado una América Latina en proceso de transformación. Las sociedades civiles demandan una nueva ética en la gestión pública y administradores privados que sean transparentes y que rechacen la corrupción, tema lo cual ellos llevan muy atado a su historia y todavía siguen batallando contra ella. O sea, eso es una herida que no termina fácilmente. Sin embargo, han avanzado grandemente en esa área, siendo ahora atractivos para los Estados Unidos, siendo atractivos para Europa, siendo atractivos para Asia, lo cual eran lugares que antes nadie miraba, o por lo menos ellos no lo miraban con esa visión. En un reciente debate en París, que nuestro amigo aquí estuvo allí, del Foro de Mercados Emergentes se presentaron las megatendencias para el año 2050, en las cuales queda evidenciado que América Latina forma parte en mayor medida de las soluciones que de los problemas estructurales del futuro. Así que nuevamente un posicionamiento sólido, importante para las soluciones del futuro, están radicándose en América Latina y la gente lo ha identificado como tal. Aprender a conducir nuestro desarrollo en esta dirección es el objetivo de una clase empresarial comprometida y proactiva, y es aquí donde puede radicar también oportunidades para Puerto Rico. América Latina puede sobresalir aún más fortaleciendo su cadena de producción. También esto lo discutimos en otros foros anteriores, cómo Puerto Rico, aunque nosotros no estamos produciendo grandes cantidades agrícolas o manufacturas, sí en la cadena de valor agregado podemos tener una función importante para la globalización y para hacer el puente entre América Latina y Estados Unidos y América Latina, y nuevamente solidificar la región del Caribe con la apertura de Cuba. Así que esas son mentalidades que vamos cambiando poco a poco. Antes mirábamos a Cuba de una manera, ahora lo estamos mirando de otra. Antes mirábamos a Asia de una manera, ahora lo estamos mirando de otra. Aprender a conducir nuestro desarrollo en esa dirección es el objetivo de una clase empresarial comprometida. América Latina puede sobresalir en estas áreas, como estamos hablando de cadena de producción, en específico en la agroindustria. Más aún cuando uno de los principales temas de preocupación mundial es la seguridad alimentaria. También es preciso prestar atención a inversiones en distintos tipos de generación de energía, lo cual es un tema principal de toda la región, el procesamiento de ciertos recursos naturales y bien interesante la conservación del agua, entre otros. Es un tema bien importante, hay grandes inversiones en esa área y ellos lo están viendo de esa misma manera. El CEAL también está analizando temas de relevancia regional. La industria farmacéutica es una de ellas, que prevé la posibilidad de mejorar significativamente en los países si se desarrollan acciones concretas de cooperación de las organizaciones reguladoras. Y farmacéuticas en Latinoamérica quizás no eran tan importantes o tan desarrolladas como van a ser en el futuro. La integración energética fue objeto de debates en los grupos, tratando de integrar las regiones y mejorar competitividad y seguridad de redes. Este tema también sigue porque ellos están mirando cómo pueden conectar, hacer un corredor energético desde México hasta Brasil. O sea, y nosotros pensamos que una distancia entre Miami a Puerto Rico es imposible y verdaderamente es mucho más cerca de lo que nosotros imaginamos como soluciones posibles para el desarrollo del problema energético que tiene Puerto Rico. Conectar a Cuba, a Santo Domingo, a Puerto Rico, o sea, son puentes energéticos que se van a estar viendo en el futuro y ya existen, o sea, no es nada nuevo. Queda claro que las inversiones públicas privadas son la solución y no el problema. Esto es algo que también nosotros debatimos a diario con nuestro gobierno y ya ellos están sumamente adelantados en esa área, ya lo han comprobado y han visto los resultados. El atractivo para remitir propuestas a través de las fronteras de los países depende de un marco regulador común y bien aceptado por los mercados. Por último, hubo un gran interés en la moción presentada por el Sur. En la última reunión yo les dije que América Latina tiene una sobredosis de conglomerados y de básicamente agrupaciones que ya no saben ni cómo hacer del Sur, el Mercosur, relación con Estados Unidos, sin Estados Unidos, relaciones entre España y Centroamérica. O sea, hay más de 15 de estas uniones, pero significa que sí se están conectando y poco a poco se está viendo cuál de ellas es la más beneficiosa para toda la región. Esto es una iniciativa, para que vean qué interesante, de varios países de América Central, ¿okay? Que son los países menos poderosos probablemente en América Latina, ¿verdad? Teniendo México, teniendo Brasil, teniendo China, teniendo Argentina, Centroamérica siempre. Así que ellos se han unido para hacer esta iniciativa América Central y del Sur se busca cooperación subregional en iniciativas de infraestructura para aumentar su nivel de negocio. ¿Okay? Así que nada, con eso quería comenzar, porque esa es la razón de ser de esta organización, de poder mirar cómo América Latina se relaciona con Puerto Rico, cómo nosotros nos podemos relacionar con América Latina, dónde radican las posibilidades y para nosotros es importante estar seguros de ver cuál es la mentalidad que ellos están mirando al mundo y cómo nosotros podemos ser parte de ello. Pero la realidad es que nosotros tenemos que resolver nuestras situaciones primero. Y yo creo que para eso fue que vinimos hoy, sobre todo por dos cosas. Uno, nuestro marco económico, ¿verdad? Y de competitividad que nos permite ser atractivos, no solamente para gente que invierte aquí, sino para que nosotros nos abran las puertas para invertir allá afuera. Y por el otro lado, el factor de reputación, imagen, que hemos tenido en los últimos 4 o 5 meses. Probablemente estamos en los niveles más bajos que ha existido en la historia de Puerto Rico. O sea, podemos ir a Estados Unidos, podemos ir a América Latina, y les confieso que vender a Puerto Rico es bien difícil. Hace 2 años atrás, cuando empezamos, estábamos bien entusiasmados. Ya cuando voy a América Latina y me encuentro con este foro, es como, estamos en la lista de Venezuela, estamos en la lista de Argentina, estamos en la lista de esos otros países de Brasil, para verlos. Así que tenemos que retomar eso y para eso es que estamos aquí hoy. Voy a cambiar el inglés ahora porque vamos entonces a entrar directamente al tema que nos ocupa hoy. Primero que nada, our warmest welcome to our special guest, Mr. Jim Milstein, which is right here. Thank you so much for being here, taking the time, being a brave man. I've seen you before, so I know that you will do it again. And our distinguished group of panelists, Claudio Loser, Director of Centennial Group and Chief Executive Officer of Centennial Group Latin America, former Director of the Western Hemisphere of the Intermonetary Fund, Advisor to the Puerto Rico bondholder. Please, Mr. Claudio. José Sosa Llorens, Representative for Puerto Rico Cooperativas. Jorge San Miguel on behalf of AMBAC Insurance for Puerto Rico bondholders. Okay, CEAL is an organization of the business community of Latin America. CEAL has gone throughout major countries' transformations through its history. Some of them very positive and successful, and others very unfortunate and devastating to their country's economic and political structures. We're not very far from that situation in Puerto Rico, or to say the least, we are very close to that situation in Puerto Rico. Living in an environment of uncertainty, misinformation, interpretations, speculations, which make it very hard to understand our future economic path. In our last visit to Washington, and I quote, this was my highlight, they said, the fiscal board responsibility will only set the deliverables. You will come up with a plan yourself. Okay? This was the biggest statement or the biggest perspective that I have had within all this process. It is very difficult to understand that 6 people are going to come to Puerto Rico and they're just going to take the entire government structure on their hands. And it was very clearly said, we'll set up the deliveries, you come up with a plan. This will certainly challenge our true capabilities to manage our country in the political arena as well as in the economic development platform. So it's also interesting when we were saying, well, if a fiscal board comes into Puerto Rico, why do we need a government? Or why do we need a House of Representatives? Or why do we need a Senate? And from my perspective, it's totally the contrary. They're going to be tested to the highest levels of performance because they're going to have to deliver. They're just going to have a new boss. with different expectations and different standards. So that is something that, just to put in perspective, and we will learn more about that very, very soon. I hope this opportunity provides us with some real deep dive into the topic that most concerns Puerto Rico and our business leaders. With us to discuss this matter is Mr. Tim Milstein, Chief and Executive Officer of Milstein and Company. His representation history includes U.S. Airways in connection with its acquisition of American Airlines out of Chapter 11. United Auto Workers in connection with the restructuring of their contractual relationship with GM, Ford, and Chrysler. Also represented the Republic of Argentina in connection with the exchange offer for its international bond indebtedness. Daewoo Corporation in connection with its financial restructuring in Korea. Disney Corporation in connection with the financial restructuring of Euro Disney in France. He also represented Pan American Airlines in connection with its Chapter 11 reorganization. And finally, the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico in connection with the management of its $75 billion of institutional indebtedness. As you can see, we're part of a very distinguished list. Quite a roster. And certainly, we're not alone in this scenario that we're facing today. So that's a reality. I mean, people have gone through this in major dimensions. Not only governments, but big corporations around the world. And we're sitting here to see how we're just going to move forward through this process. After Mr. Milstein's presentation, he will be joined by Mr. Claudio Locer, Mr. Jose Sosa Llorens, and Jorge San Miguel, each representing interest groups with different positions regarding the management of the debt. Nicholas Kogan, Chief Executive Officer for American Leading Financial, and Joan Isabel Gonzalez, Business Reporter of El Nuevo Dia, will moderate the discussion. Participants will have the opportunity to make questions at the end of Mr. Milstein's presentation and after the debate. So we'll have two sections of questions and answers. We will distribute cards where you can write your questions, and we will collect them to distribute them to the panel. Finally, I hope you enjoy this conversation and leave with some answers to what we can expect in regard to the possible solutions of the crisis that we're confronting. With you, I present Mr. Jim Milstein.
Thanks for that kind introduction. I haven't gotten a lot of applause over the last 2.5 years of doing this. I want to start out with two quotes. One quote from the former chief economic advisor to President Nixon, a guy named Herb Stein, who famously said, if something can't go on forever, it won't. And it seems obvious, but that I think is true about the debt such as stock in Puerto Rico. And the other is from I guess they're calling him the putative or presumptive nominee of the Republican Party, who last night said, and when he was interviewed, I love debt, he repeated. I love reducing debt, and I know how to do it better than anybody. I will tell you, Puerto Rico has too much debt, so you can't just restructure. You have to use the laws. You have to cut the debt way down and get back to business. So I'm going to try and put the putative representative of the Republican Party's comments in some perspective. This stuff, all of these slides you can get off of the GDP website. These are all work product of the working group, which the governor appointed back last July to come up with a fiscal adjustment plan for Puerto Rico going forward. But part of you can't fix a problem until you identify what the problem is. And the solution has to be related to analysis of what the problem is. And so just to set the stage for all of you, Puerto Rico has been in, and most of you have experienced this, so I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but people up on the mainland don't know this, and so these slides are very useful up there. Puerto Rico has been in economic contraction for the last, at least the last 10 years. You can see the GDP Economic Activity Index is down 20% over that period, and you've had a little peak in real growth here, but there was enormous federal stimulus spending that came in under ARA, the American Reinvestment and Recovery Act, which was the big stimulus bill that was passed in 2009, right after Obama joined office. That was largely infrastructure spending stimulus. Puerto Rico got, I think, $7 billion was allocated to Puerto Rico. It took about a year and a half for those projects to be authorized, and so you've got a little uptick. You also had a significant tax cut in 2011 that was a one-time stimulus. But again, after those stimulus funds and that tax cut abated, the economy resumed its trend. Most importantly, the demographics are moving away. You've had a decline in population from 2006 to 2014 of almost 8%. The United States, by contrast, has been growing. Puerto Rico has been going in the other direction. This is the most troubling of these demographic statistics, which is the population under age 5. It means the future workforce in Puerto Rico. In 2000, there were 295,000 kids. In 2014, there are 187,000, so a decline of almost 40%. This does not bode well for the future. One of the things you hear up in Washington, and sometimes down here too, given the political rivalry, is that the government has not done enough to help itself. That the government has failed to cut expenditures, has failed to raise taxes, has failed to do what is necessary to fix its own house and put its own house in order. And what we've done here is just list, over the course of the last 2 administrations, really 3 administrations, of what has gone on to try to address the imbalance in the government's budgets. There's the creation of the sales and use tax in 2007. It's been raised twice since. Act 154. You've had a stabilization fee at UPR. These are all revenue raisers. A reset of Act 154, the petroleum products tax increase from $3 to $9, the new gross profits tax on corporations, the SUT charged at the point of entry, which actually has increased enforcement, made it much easier, an increase in the petroleum tax last year from $9 to $15. The SUT increased from 7 to 11.5%, and we'll see whether the legislature follows through with the institution of that. Supposed to happen this year. On the expenditure side, we've had a series of layoffs, both temporary and involuntary. You've had a suspension of automatic wage increases under collective bargaining agreements, a series of budget reductions in various departments. Net, and actually I had a conversation with an important Republican congressman yesterday in which he said, government employment is up. How can that be? And I said, well, that's actually not true. Just the numbers that you're being fed are wrong. Government employment is actually down quite considerably over this period from 2006 forward. There have been a series of other structural reforms, but this is the one that has gotten us in effect where we are. So for the last 10 years, Puerto Rico has run operating deficits. And how does it net those operating deficits? It's borrowed money. At the turn of the century, Puerto Rico had $20 billion in debt. Today it is $72 billion in debt. 16 years, the debt went up by $52 billion. You do not see around the island of Puerto Rico $52 billion of new highways, new airports, new bridges, new tunnels, new rail systems. That $52 billion largely went to pay operating deficit at PREPA, at PRASA, at the central government, at UPR, at every one of the major agencies. The budgets were unbalanced, and it was filled with debt. The this game can't go on. This is where Herb Stein's phrase comes from. If something can't go on forever, it won't. So, the government of Puerto Rico was extremely innovative over the last 16 years in raising debt. They found lots of different ways to do it. Unusually creative in the ways of finding debt, creating a special purpose entity called COFINA, creating a sales tax, allocating a sales tax to a special purpose entity, raising debt against that. What was the proceeds of that debt used to do? It was used to refinance maturing geo debt, to pay, so interest is budgeted in the budget, but with the budget out of balance, interest is not paid from tax revenues, it's paid from the proceeds of new borrowing. The net consequence of that is, this is called scoop and toss. You scoop up the interest coming due and toss it to the back in the new financing. And Puerto Rico has been doing this to a fairly well for the last 16 years. In effect, not covering the cost of its debt through its revenues, but just borrowing more money to pay the debt as the interest bill as it comes due, and the debt and the principal amounts as it comes due. So here is this year's month by month TSA liquidity. So this is the general fund treasury account. The ending bank balance as of the end of the month. So these blue lines reflect what we were facing in July. We were looking at a liquidity position that was negative throughout the year. We had not yet teed up the conversation with creditors that you'll hear some of outplayed out in front of you later. We had not yet teed up with the creditors as a whole that we thought, and that the government thought, that the debt was unsustainable and had to be restructured. And so rather than declare an immediate default then, we engaged in a series of self-help measures to get through this period so that we could have a conversation over the course of this year directly with the creditors to see if we couldn't come to a resolution of this debt crisis on a consensual basis. And just to refresh your recollection, Ann Kruger was hired by the government, former IMF executive director, who did a study that was released at the end of June of last year, just at the beginning of this period, which said the debt is unsustainable, said that the government fiscal house is out of whack. It said structural reforms were required in order to put Puerto Rico back on a growth trajectory. So a three-legged stool: fiscal reform, debt restructuring, structural reform. Pretty classic IMF playbook. We took that together with the working group. The working group took that and turned that into a fiscal adjustment plan that was published in September. That fiscal adjustment plan ultimately has 10-year projections of revenue measures and expense measures to bring the budget into balance, and structural reforms to try to promote economic growth. It doesn't go far enough. Did it have everything on everyone's wish list? No, but it was a good faith attempt to try to bring structural reform and fiscal sanity back to the budget process of Puerto Rico. So, but we were already running out of money and were illiquid. So we designed a series of self-help measures. We did an internal trans financing, had one of the entities that actually had cash lend money to the central government. One of the government entities that had cash lend it to the central government because no lender was prepared to provide tax revenue anticipation notes, short-term financing, trans, to the government. A series we extended payments. We further hurt local suppliers by not paying them even on the delayed terms that we were paying. So we were basically borrowing from local suppliers to pay our debt, borrowing from agencies that had cash balances to pay our debt. And the net result of all of those self-help measures was that these blue lines turned into these red lines. We were operating on fumes, but we were operating and paying our debt. And In October, after the publication of the FEGP, we began conversations with the creditors. We hadn't made a proposal, but we laid out to them these numbers. And so we created a 10-year projection based on current fiscal policies and debt service of the fiscal balance of the government. And that showed that there was a negative $63 billion hole over the next 10 years in the government's finances. As I said, the working group came up with a series of new revenue measures that, I can't quite read it on that screen myself. It's, what? $20-odd billion. So that closed part of this financing gap with new revenue measures projected to be implemented over the 10-year period. A set of expense reduction measures that would close more of that gap. Those measures, however, new computer systems for the Treasury Department so that it can actually collect the sales tax and the like, cost some money. So we had to deduct the expense of implementing these measures, which would leave a total estimated financing gap after the implementation of all of those measures and assuming no debt restructuring of $34 billion. Just to put that in context, there's $33 billion of principal and interest coming due during this period. So even if we zeroed out the debt and paid nothing for the next 10 years, there would be still a hole to fill. The fiscal and economic growth plan also includes structural reforms that are intended to facilitate business investment, to make it easier to run a business on island. And we anticipated that if those structural reforms were made, and together with getting the government's tax system to be more predictable and regular, that there would be real economic growth, something the island hasn't seen since 2006. And the benefit of real economic growth would cut into that deficit because you would have growth that would increase the tax revenues, not based on higher rates, but just based on greater economic activity. That would leave a $23 billion financing gap, or about 2/3 of the current debt service. So on its own, that suggested that a serious debt restructuring was required in order to make this dog hunt, as they say. So the question is, and this is a debate that we've been having with creditor groups, with economists representing creditors, with economists at the Treasury Department, with economists at the IMF, with economists at the Federal Reserve for the last 9 months, which is it a solvency crisis or is it a liquidity crisis? It's clearly a liquidity crisis. We've almost run out of money already. We ran out of money basically a year ago, but through these self-help measures have managed to keep it going. So in order to answer this solvency question, we've got to think about how much debt service can an economy, how much of the revenues that a government collects be devoted to debt service without the debt service crowding out necessary public investment, or so penalizing the private sector that it crowds out and deters private investment. And one way to get your hands around this question is to look at comparable governments. And so Moody's does and has done for the last 10 years a review of debt service as a percentage of revenues, debt service, net taxable debt as a percentage per capita. How much does the debt service divided by the number of people represent? What is the debt service as a percentage of personal income in the jurisdiction? And what is the debt service as a percentage of GDP? So you can see the highest state debt service to revenues is Hawaii, another island state. Connecticut has the highest net tax supported debt per capita of $5,491. Hawaii, again, debt service as percentage of personal income, 11%, and of GDP, 9%. Puerto Rico today is dedicating 36% of its government revenues to debt service. That is $14,000 a head on island. Average income on island is $19,000. Obviously, you're not paying all the debt at once, but otherwise, no one would be here. As a percent of personal income, average personal income, 77%. I mean, it's not even the same zip code as the rest of these states. And as a percent of GDP, 47%. So, I mean, I think this is obvious. I don't think this is a close call. This is a solvency problem, not just a liquidity problem. This is more debt than this economy can bear. This debt is, think about it as just current expenditure, 36% of all tax supported, of all revenues being dedicated to debt service. And compare it to the highest states, which are in the low teens. So take Hawaii. Hawaii is spending 23% of its budget more on education, health, infrastructure, facilitating private and public investment than Puerto Rico is. And that's the highest state. The median state is dedicating only 5% of its total revenue to debt service, leaving 95% of the budget to invest in health, education, welfare, infrastructure spending, the things that promote economic growth. So no wonder Puerto Rico is suffering in the economic decline. There's a book I recommend highly to you by two IMF economists, Rogoff and Reinhardt, was done after the 2007-8 fiscal crisis, called This Time It's Different, in which they did a comparison of the most indebted governments in the world going back 300 years, as long as statistics have been kept on these matters. And their conclusion after surveying that was when debt gets to be more than 90% of GDP, it becomes a burden on economic growth because of just this factor. Because it becomes a burden on what the state can spend on the things that promote economic growth, an educated workforce, a infrastructure that supports business investment, a healthy workforce. It represents too much of a burden on individual spending, on household spending, which deters economic growth if you can't spend it, if you're not reinvesting it in the form of spending an investment on island, but sending it offshore to foreign investors, you're taking cash out of the economy. Today, Puerto Rico's debt is in excess of 100% of its GNP. And when you add in the unfunded pension benefits, it's at 150% of its GNP. So it's way outside the Reinhardt and Rogoff stats on where debt becomes a burden on economic growth and on the vitality of a community. So another meme, I'll call it, that we've had to confront in dealing with the federal Congress is you're not engaged with your creditors. You're not talking to your creditors. You're not negotiating with your creditors. And nothing could be further from the truth. As I said, the first thing we have to do with the creditors is agree that this is a problem, that there's actually a problem, that it's not a liquidity crisis. It's not merely that we can't play scoop and toss games in the municipal market again and take debt that's maturing and throw it out another 30 years in order to balance the budget. It's not just that it's in a solvency crisis. And so all of these foregoing slides and more, we have shared with the creditors and their advisors starting in September to try and at least agree on the common problem. And I gotta tell you, I think of myself as a relatively persuasive guy who made very little headway in persuading the creditors that this is a solvency problem. In part because most of the creditors don't care. Most of the creditors say, I'm a GEO holder. The government has $10 billion of revenues. How come they can't pay $1.2 billion to me? That's only 12%. Or I'm a COFINA holder. The government is collecting $800 million of sales tax revenue. I'm owed $600 million a year on the current debt service schedule. Why can't I pay that to me? I'm a highway and transportation bond holder. You've got a new petroleum tax that covers my debt service. Why can't you pay that to me? Each of them is looking very narrowly at the revenues that support, or that allegedly support their debt service, and what they're missing is this picture, is that this debt service burden overall is penalizing and punishing investment in education, in health, in infrastructure, those things which promote business investment and household formation. They are missing that this island is shrinking. The tax base is shrinking. And so, yeah, we managed over the course of this year through a series of self-help measures, depleting the remaining cash in the system in order to avoid a default, that there's no cash left. I mean, the Government Development Bank defaulted last Monday. So, try as hard as we can to get the creditors to focus on the big picture, on the economy which generates the tax revenues to pay them, none of them really want to focus on that. Unfortunately, that focus is now unavoidable because this picture of just unsustainable deficits and an inability to even pay debt service going forward without incremental measures in excess of those that we've identified. So much more structural and political revenue and expense reform than even the working group could come up with. So what's going on? We have made two proposals. One in January, one at the end of February, after getting feedback from the creditors. And we basically proposed a reprofiling. This is the original debt service structure. The annual debt service for this $50 billion of debt wanders between $3.5 and $4 billion a year for the next 20 years, and ultimately, declines starting out here in 2043. We said we can't afford that. We have the deficits are too big. What we will try to do is create a level debt service, so a predictable amount of debt that the future politicians can plan for. And we need some time to rebuild our cash balances and to make pro-growth investments, finish the highways around the island, do a couple of things that are just glaringly obvious to promote business investment and incremental tourism on island. But after that 5-year period, we would start with level debt service of about $1.8 billion. And if the economy, as a result of all these structural changes and reforms, starts growing again, we will share that growth in revenue with the creditors. The creditors sort of like this, but it's this idea of sharing the growth with them. But it has some tax problems. It is not a traditional municipal triple tax exempt instrument. And so we, after taking in feedback, we said, okay, we'll slightly raise the level debt service to 15 to 16% of revenues, again, higher than any other state. And instead of giving you a growth bond, we'll create a more traditional municipal bond instrument called a cab, which is basically a zero coupon PIK bond. And we'll put that PIK bond all the way at the back of the queue. So it will accrete over this period of time while we're paying cash interest and principal on the base bonds. So these green lines were converted into these orange lines, which is a fixed payment instrument. And the response we got from the creditors was, yeah, it's better. But each of them basically said, not enough for me. Like, that's fine for those other guys, but not for me. For me, I want to be paid in full. The GEOs, unconstitutionally protected debt paid in full. Well, the GEO debt service here will eat up almost to this line, right here. So that's all that would be left for the other $32 billion of creditors. So we said to the GEO holders, it's not going to work, because the other $32 billion of holders are going to be suing us. And nobody's going to invest in Puerto Rico while $32 billion of holders are suing us. We've got to find an equitable way to allocate the available debt service, the available capacity for debt service. Same thing with the Cofina holders. The Cofina holders there's enough here for us. Just pay us this bit, right here. We'll take half of that and leave the other half for the other $32 billion of holdings. We told them, sorry guys, that's not going to work. The monoline insurers who insure $10 billion of this debt said, we're not going to take any haircuts at all. We don't do that. We're insurers. What? Really? I thought you were insurers. You insure against credit risk. That credit risk has come home to roost. You, like the bondholders, are going to have to take a discount. No, we don't do that. That's not our business model. Our business model is to collect premiums and not pay claims. We pay claims, but then the issuer pays us. Again, I kind of shrug your shoulders and say, okay, I know that's your business model, but there isn't enough capacity to do all of that. So we have continued, I'm going to try to shorten this to leave room for questions. We have continued, notwithstanding that these proposals have been rejected, we are continuing to get counter proposals from creditors. I think it is slowly dawning on them that it is a solvency crisis and a liquidity crisis, that we have short-term funding needs and problems, and we have long-term debt sustainability problems. But this is exactly what insolvency regimes were made for. Insolvency regimes were invented to solve a collective action problem. The collective action problem that I have 11 different issues of in the aggregate, $50 billion worth of debt. Every one of the creditors said there's enough there for me. If I can get to the courthouse first and get the recovery first, I'll get mine, and everyone else won't get theirs. The collective action problem is that works for the first guy and the second guy, but it leaves the other 9 guys with an empty bag. So in order to ensure an equitable allocation of a limited pie among a large set of claims, you have to create one forum and force all of the creditors into that forum and have a judge moderate and the disputes as to who really has priority. Is COFINA an illegal debt issuance because it was intended to evade the 15% limit under the Constitution on general obligation debt, or is it just a good structured finance product that is legal and valid and binding? These are questions that are going to animate the fight over a limited pie between the GO holders and the COFINA holders. Are the highway petroleum taxes and tolls, are they clawbackable forever? The instrument that sold those bonds said they're subject to clawback in favor of the GO. Are they clawbackable forever? I don't know. If the government's running a forever deficit and you can't pay the GOs, then probably yes, they're clawbackable forever, which means those bondholders may be entitled to nothing. I don't know the answer to this question. One judge needs to decide because it affects the GO recovery and the highway and transportation bondholders recovery. So this is what Puerto Rico has been asking for from the federal Congress is nothing different than a solution that the federal Congress has given to similar problems in the past, beginning in 1896 when the first National Bankruptcy Act was passed. And every time a bankruptcy law has been proposed by the federal Congress, there's been a flurry of lobbying activity by creditors to try to give themselves priority and make sure the law had special provisions for them. It brings out the most amazing evidence of how our system works. And you can go to Capitol Hill today and see that live, not on tape, because that's what's going on today with every different stripe of bondholder seeking to insert a provision that says GOs come first, COFINAs come first, insurers come first. I'm actually, notwithstanding the fact that Speaker Ryan has really stood up and taken this on his back and tried to get this through. I think the creditors may have, opened, let the genie out of the bottle and have made passage impossible with well-financed advertising campaigns that bankruptcy is a bailout, which is obviously not, it's just a bankruptcy law, it's not a bailout, it's not the federal government writing checks like it did to GM and Chrysler or to AIG. It's just providing a legal form in which these conflicts can be resolved. Conflicts that would otherwise go on for years, I predict, before they're resolved by other courts. I just don't know if those genies can be put back in the bottle. I think they've scared a Republican Congress against doing anything, and the crisis may have to deepen before Congress actually acts. You know, it's just unfortunate the way our system works. But I remain hopeful that maybe something will come of it. And in the face of that uncertainty on Capitol Hill, the uncertainty down here, I would say creditor negotiations have actually intensified. You see, with Jose Sosa's help, we got a provisional agreement at the GDP with both the hedge funds and the cooperativas that needs more work, and ultimately we hope will be folded into a larger deal, but it's like PREPA, a first step. The PREPA deal needs more work, both legislative help, and then we have to solicit more holders, because we only have 60% of the credit involved. Similarly with GDP, we've got a good first step, and with the GO holders, and with the large mutual funds, and with the insurers, and the COFINA holders, we have now a much more serious dialogue, in which there's a recognition that this is a solvency crisis and the debt stock really does need to be reduced. And the question is, going back to this chart, there's some financial engineering here that we can do to try to create more capacity in there and therefore smaller haircuts, and maybe we'll throw back in some growth bonds back into the mix because actually some creditors really like them. And it is a way that if we do turn the island around to make the investors invested in growth and beneficiaries of that growth if it occurs. So with that, I'm going to stop and take some questions.
If anyone needs cards to write their questions.
This question is whether all of the bond prospectuses have the same tricky wording about risk factors that the 214 GEO bond prospectus has, or only that one. And did Cleary Gottlieb counsel the government on the 2014, I assume it's the 2014 statements. The 2014 bond issue, which we sold $3.5 billion of bonds at 8% interest, if that wasn't a sign that the government was in trouble. I don't know what is. Most municipal borrowers borrow at, even the state of Illinois is still borrowing at 3%. Cleary will have to speak for itself. I don't know whether they did or did not comment. I don't think they were issuer counsel on the 2014. But I know that the 2014 bond indenture said, don't buy this security in about 40 different ways because of the possible distress. I will say that I went back and did sampling of some of the different bond issues during the period 2006 that was preceded, just to make sure that Puerto Rico was disclosing its scoop and toss and the risks around COFINA vis-a-vis the constitutional debt limit. And no one, if a bondholder had read the indentures and the disclosures, they would know exactly what the proceeds were being used for scoop and toss, and that there were questions around whether or not COFINA was an evasion of the 15% limitation of the Constitution. Next question, was Milstein hired before or after the 2014 bond issue? I was hired just before. We were hired in, I think the first month we worked was in February, just before the March issue. That was well down the road. Was Milstein hired before or after the 20th list? Yes, I just answered that. When was our engagement made public? I don't know. One of the reporters probably knows. Chapter 9 proponents say that although Puerto Rican bankruptcy powers would represent an unprecedented change and a disrespect for the rule of law, laws change all the time, and there's language in the prospectus 2014, at least, advising of the risks of those changes in law. Changes like that, as well as defaults and moratoriums led Argentina into a 15-year period of no access to the capital markets. Only recently did that change, with the mere change in political leadership, tone, and manner, and credible commitment to structural changes. How do you see Puerto Rico differently, aside from the status issue? Puts us away to leadership. So, let me answer the first question first. Everybody who makes a contract in the United States makes that contract subject to the federal Congress's power to make uniform bankruptcy laws. That's just the environment in which contracts are made and enforced in the United States. The Congress of the United States has, under the Constitution, the power to make uniform laws on bankruptcy. And those laws have, I'm a bankruptcy student and expert, and I can say almost every bankruptcy act that the Congress has passed has been made retroactive in its application, every time they pass one. The Supreme Court has had a chance to rule on this on a number of occasions by aggrieved creditors and has never found that controversial. Every creditor who is facing a new bankruptcy law and its retroactive application says, this is a violation of the rule of law, but this is one of the risks you take when you make a contract in the United States. I don't think that rule of law criticism of what Congress is trying to do is anything than slow here. It just has no force of law. Argentina. So, this is a classic example of the need for a restructuring regime. Argentina, I revised the government in 2005 when they finally, after 5 years of default, launched an exchange offer for their international indebtedness. They got about 65% participation. 35% of the bondholders held out in 2005. And I was gone in 2008, 9, and 10 when they amended the offer again and opened it up again. And they got up to 90% to participate over the next 5 years. But Aurelius and Elliott Associates famously chased them around the world for 15 years, enforcing their debt. And they only just now, 15 years after the default, settled. Because they had no mechanism to bind holdouts. We got 66% of the creditors at the outset to participate. Had Argentina had the ability through a collective action clause mechanism or a Chapter 9 mechanism for the majority to bind the minority, it would have been over in 2005. And the same problem is what Puerto Rico faces. I think we will reach agreements with substantial majorities of all of the major credits. And maybe we'll reach them sooner than later, actually. Because I think the crisis has finally sunk in with the creditors. This is real. And the governor isn't lying about the numbers. The numbers are the best numbers available. And that we've got IMF-level economists in my firm and a whole bunch of other firms putting our own credibility on the line behind the best numbers we could produce out of this government, saying this is a solvency crisis. And I think the creditors are finally believing that. And so I think we could have substantial majorities of creditors agreeing to it. But there are millions of Puerto Rican bondholders. In terms of the numbers, we are never going to get 100%. Some of them don't even know they have bonds in their 401k. So we need some mechanism by which a majority can bind the minority so that we don't face what Argentina has faced for the last 10 years, which is being chased around the globe by a couple of hedge funds who bought the stuff at a discount and want to get a better deal than the majority was willing to take. I got a little more time, so I'll keep answering these questions. Why has the Puerto Rican government, for the first time in recent history, not issued financial statements? Okay, this is, again, another one of these things that has been blown way out of proportion. most governments are 9 months to 12 months late in the issuance of their financials. Puerto Rico is way late, no doubt about it. Why haven't? So we're now talking about the financial statements for the period ending June 30, 2014. It is now almost 2 years stale. A lot of stuff has happened since. The Government Development Bank puts out quarterly financial statements, the best numbers they have available to them, and has done since. What is missing is this audited financial. So here's the conundrum our auditors face. You're KPMG, Pricewaterhouse, whatever major accounting firm you might be part of. Government of Puerto Rico hands you information for June 30, 2014 that is finally assembled from its 11 different issuers of debt, the various 130 different funds that are comprised within the government's operations. Finally gives you that information in the third quarter of 2015 for you to certify that those numbers present in all material respects the financial condition of the Commonwealth. Okay, you're already a year and a quarter late, but that's not really that much later than other major issuers in the municipal market. But now you're struggling with this fact. The governor of Puerto Rico has said the debt on that balance sheet is unpayable. That without the extraordinary actions, without these extraordinary actions to turn these blue lines into these red lines over the period, we gave them the financial information here. So without these extraordinary actions, we'd be in default, out of money, illiquid. So you're the auditor certifying statements a year and a half earlier. Can you realistically say that the numbers there fairly present, which is accounting code for this balance sheet is stable and this government can meet its obligations in the ordinary course? That's what that magic language in a auditor's letter means. Fairly presents in all material respects means the balance sheet is stable and the government can meet its obligations in the ordinary course. If you're certifying as to June 30, 2014, and you know this, how do you do it? What do you say without opening yourself up to lots of questions? So I feel for our auditors. The numbers are there. All that's missing is the letter. And they don't know whether they should put a going concern qualification. It presents in all material respects, but we note that we do not believe the Commonwealth as of June 30th, 2014 is a going concern because we know this is going to happen. In 2015, we're living through it. That's why those audited financials have not been produced, not because the financials haven't been produced, the numbers are there. We publish them. It's the letter, because the auditors don't know what to say. And I feel for them. I wouldn't know what to say in those circumstances. Any creditor that wishes to sit with the GDP government of Puerto Rico has to go through Milco and clearing, sign NDAs, and then gain access. This is complete nonsense. I have been having conversations with individual creditors for the last 9 months. My calendar is replete with meetings with individual creditors. The issue is, if I'm going to share with them information outside of this information, which is frankly all anyone needs to make an informed judgment as to how to structure the debt. But there's some other stuff that we could talk to them about, current collections that haven't yet been published and the like. Yes, for that we need an NDA, so I can prevent other investors from being taken advantage of by these investors in the markets, because they would have superior information. So we have asked people to sign non-disclosure agreements and to refrain from trading if we're going to give them information the market doesn't have. But we've been publishing, tons of information to help people make an informed decision. And within the boundaries of that information, we've been having very serious conversations with individual creditors, with groups of creditors represented by financial advisors and law firms. This is nonsense. This is just, lobbying. Given that the public debt structure of most, if not all, U.S. states is much more decentralized than in Puerto Rico, with much residing in cities, counties, school districts, etc., supporting the federal debt through federal income taxes, do you still think the comparison of the states is valid? Yes. So that's been one of the points people make to us is, you know, Connecticut, this is Connecticut's debt service to revenues. It doesn't include its Greenwich or Stanford. So it's apples to apples, they say. Except Hawaii is actually organized very much like Puerto Rico. Most of the services provided in Hawaii are done by the central government, not by the municipalities. Municipalities perform similar functions to those here. So that's one. Two, the other criticism is Puerto Rico, because it doesn't have federal income taxes, when you look at, you know, the net taxable debt service as a percentage of personal income or per capita, you're missing for those states, those individuals in the 50 states who pay income taxes are also bearing that burden. But 50% of the tax burden, 50% of the federal budget is paid with employment taxes, which Puerto Rico does pay. So 50% of the federal debt is allocable to Puerto Rico. We don't pay income taxes, but frankly, given the levels of income here, there wouldn't be a lot of income tax being paid under federal tax laws today by Puerto Ricans anyway. So I think these are not only directionally correct, like mostly correct, and this criticism of, you know, the comparisons are unfair is just misplaced. Again, lobbying. And sort of refusal to recognize that regardless of debt stock, regardless of that, those issues go to debt stock and sustainability. But this is the real problem. I mean, based on current fiscal policies and growth rates, economic growth rates in Puerto Rico, there's a $63 billion deficit over the next 10 years. Even with revenue measures and expense measures that the working group came up with, and we got a lot of noise back from the Senate and Assembly on their willingness to implement. You only close half of it. It's just not sustainable on a cash. We just don't have the cash without massive tax increases and massive reduction in government services to pay the debt. So we can turn Puerto Rico into a municipal investor playbook, where most of revenues, where 40% of revenues are being dedicated to debt service. There will be no one here, I predict, in 10 years. Because as much as I love this island, and I know you who are from Puerto Rico in this room love this island, you can't turn the government into a debt collection agency that doesn't provide essential services to its citizens. They will not stay. You know, you're all citizens of the United States. You can move to more economically vital parts of the country. It's just not credible. One more question, and then I have to give the loyal opposition an opportunity to say how I'm wrong. The vast majority of Puerto Rico's bonds are held directly and indirectly by individual residents of both the U.S. and Puerto Rico, and not by hedge funds. In the case of individual residents of Puerto Rico realizing losses, yes, this is a problem that we are, and I'm not going to read the whole question. This is a problem we are very mindful of and trying to address. Our best estimate is that about 15 billion of the 50 billion that we are seeking to restructure are held on island. 15 billion. So 35 billion are off island. And we have, in our second proposal, we threw out something called the local option, which was a long-dated bond at par with a lower interest rate than we were providing. And we got, I would say, kind of, you know, that doesn't really look that attractive. Yes, I avoid impairment of my principal, but I'm living off of this income. Some people said I'm living off of this income. So we need a higher interest rate. I think this may solve itself because if I'm right that we're going to make serious progress with the GO holders over the next couple of weeks, maybe, if we're lucky. I think the local option may be, the need for a local option may be mooted, at least with regard to those bonds. I think it's more problematic with regard to the concentration in the GDP credit and ERS, where there's some curious local concentration of ownership. So we've got our thinking hats on. We're trying to figure out how to deal with this because we recognize that for many local residents, the income stream off the bonds is an important source of just survival. And so we are mindful of that. And I frankly think that the hedge fund, institutional, monoline, mainland investors are sympathetic to kind of create some differentiation in favor of local holders. We've raised this with them, and they all acknowledge that local holders are part of the economic life of the island that generates spending and tax revenues that support debt service going forward. So I think we may be able to come up with a compromise that works for everyone, but it's going to take some work. And with that, I'll shut up and let my colleagues here do their thing. Thank you.
Thank you on behalf of CEAL. It was a good presentation. And the idea, hello everyone, the idea was to have every side of this equation, to have every look, every angle, and have now the opposite side, people who have represented GOs, the monoliners, the insurance monoliners, and the GOVs, local GOVs. So, and the idea also, Jim has been very generous with us, to stay and have, after they made their exposition, do a debate between among ourselves and also questions. So with that said, I'm going to start. Joan Isabel is also going to be helping. Joan Isabel is a prestigious journalist. I'm going to give her bio shortly. She's going to start introducing who are we going to have here today.
Good morning to all. Today we're going to have an incredible group of talented people, and we're going to be able to talk a little bit about these not so happy moments for some of us, for some of them. Please, I'll ask our speakers today that join us on the stage. Jorge San Miguel is the capital member and chair of Federali Energy and Environmental Law Practice Group, as well as co-chair of its Government and Legislative Affair Practice Group. He recently testified before the U.S. Congress, Committee on Natural Resources, about Puerto Rico's energy infrastructure, challenges and opportunities. He represents businesses in policymaking, permitting, regulatory, restructuring, and economic development matters before the U.S. Congress, federal agencies, and the executive and legislative branches of both the state and municipal governments.
So we're also going to have Claudio Loser. He's the CEO and president of Centennial Latin America, associated with Centennial Group of Washington, D.C. He graduated from the University of Cuyo in Argentina, that's in Mendoza, and holds a Master of Arts and PhD from the University of Chicago. He teaches at George Washington University. For 8 years, and until November 2002, Mr. Loser was director of the Western Hemisphere Department in the International Monetary Fund. Mr. Loser joined the IMF in 1972. Dr. Loser has worked with many national and international agencies. He was part of the expert support group to the ad hoc group in Puerto Rico in 2015. He's the co-editor of Latin America 2040, Breaking Away with Complacency and Agenda for Reestructurations, and of Mexico New Vision for 2042, Achieving Prosperity for All. He's also a contributor to the World in 2050, published in 2016.
Hussein Sosa Llorens is founding and managing partner at Sosa Llorens, Cruz, Neris and Associates. This is a corporate and financial law firm established in Puerto Rico in 1993. Throughout his career, Sosa Llorens has advised local and international financial institutions. He played a key role in the design and drafting of the current legal framework that regulates the cooperativas movement in Puerto Rico since 2001. He also drafted and helped with Act 220 of 2015. Previously, Sosa Llorens served as Commissioner of Financial Institutions of the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. He has been member of several distinguished organizations such as the Conference of State Bank Supervisors, International Organization of Securities Commission, and the Latin American Center for Monetary Studies. He's also a member of the Puerto Rico Bar Association and the American Bar Association.
So, I don't know if everyone is clear. So, Jorge is representing insurers. Jose is representing, the local co-ops. Claudio has been working for essentially at GOs, no? And Jim representing restructuring on behalf of the government of the public sector. Okay. So, I also have a short bio of Joan Isabel. Joan Isabel is here with me. She's a seasoned Puerto Rican journalist who has spent most of her 20 years career reporting about Puerto Rico business community and the island's economic challenges. After 4 years at Caribbean Business, Joan Isabel joined the business section of El Nuevo Dia, Puerto Rico's largest and most influential daily. A firm believer in the need of bringing economy to the forefront of Puerto Rico's public debate, Joan Isabel has reported extensively about the transformation and downturn of the island's economy, the insurance sectors, and the fallout of 4 commercial banks. I know it was a great coverage. She should get a Pulitzer. She did a great job on the last one, right? Over the past decade, her stories about the U.S. territory, fiscal and economic woes are a reference to understanding the government crisis, and some of them even predicted events of default we are discussing nowadays. Mother of 2 wonderful boys, she graduated from the University of Puerto Rico with a bachelor's and master's degree in public communication, and her work has been praised by several business organizations in Puerto Rico and Spain's Ivy Business School as well.
Thank you, Nicolas is his founder, and he is Chief Executive Officer of America's Leading Finance, a non-prime auto loan platform based in Puerto Rico. Prior to this venture, he founded Operating Partners, a company to acquire and manage distressed portfolios in partnership with a subsidiary of the National Bank of Canada. The partnership was sold in 2014 to a U.S. public company. Prior to this, he worked for over 6 years in Goldman Sachs, America's Special Situation Group. There, he invested the firm's principal money in distressed assets in Mexico, Brazil, USA, and Puerto Rico. Over the last 15 years, he has invested in a series of distressed assets in 5 different countries, over 100 transactions with a nominal value of approximately $10 billion. Nicolas is a national of Argentina, lives in San Juan with his family, with choice, has an economic degree from the University of Buenos Aires, and an MBA from Harvard Business School.
So, before we start, I have a note, an interesting note. Here we have 5 people, and 2 out of 5 from Argentina. And that's not by chance. You can understand how people in Argentina understand about restructuring, default, all the economics of it. So,
Been there, done that.
everything that you've said and everything that's going to come now is something that it's reinventing the wheel one and again and again and again. Both sides. We're going to discuss it now. And so we start. We have 5 to 10 minutes for each of you to present, and then we're going to have the debate.
I don't know how we're going to work in terms of the shift. Okay. Let's see the. Okay. So, first of all, thank you very much for this invitation. It's a real pleasure to be back in Puerto Rico. Second of all,
So you can see.
yeah, okay. let me move this way. I'm not trying to take your position.
It's the role of the debtor to
Okay.
get the hell out of the way.
Second of all, I want to thank the organizers for pronouncing my last name properly. There is one particular way it is pronounced, and usually it's not the one I like, but what can I do? Well, let me just, as an additional footnote, mention that at the moment I am not involved sort of actively in terms of the issue of Puerto Rico. when there was an ad hoc group of creditors that were willing to provide lending to Puerto Rico last year, they hired a group of us, people who had worked in the IMF at relatively high positions. Of course, the Commonwealth had hired Mrs. Kruger, who happened to be my boss during my tenure at the IMF. We loved each other, but we didn't see eye to eye. That's a separate issue. I certainly have been, I won't put words in Jim's mouth, but I have been tainted by the views of the creditors, for sure. So that's why I will not negate that situation. Let me say, I'll try to go within the natural verbosity of the Southern Hemisphere. I'll try to be as brief as possible. And let me just talk about a few things. First of all, I think that Jim made a very good presentation about the views of the island, and there are a number of things that I have to reinforce in what I say. In that the government of Puerto Rico did a lot of work in trying to improve the underlying fiscal position. And also they hired somebody who is very competent, the group led by Mrs. Kruger. It only happens that there are certain things that were not, I would say, taken into account appropriately. Obviously, the strategy that was set up in September, I think it was, it was published in September of last year.
The working group.
The working group, and then has been sort of part of the strategy, has been very, very good. One thing I have to say, and I'm sorry about this, I'm speaking here as a Latinoamericano, people in Puerto Rico love, at least what I've seen, love to play a bit the role of the victim. It happens that Puerto Rico within Latin America, if you consider that, because with all the structure, the US structure, it's a very Latin American place, has a per capita income that is higher than any other Latin American, or than any Latin American country. It is relatively low compared to the United States. It is higher than many of the OECD countries and countries in the European Union. So we're not talking about a poor place. What I find, and this has been shocking to me, is that although there has been work done, and a lot has been done in terms of adjustment, the way the fiscal program has made progress has been very awkward. And the issue of the numbers themselves, I would say, I'll put it, let me use words a little bit kindly. It's a scandal that Puerto Rico has the statistics it has, because it's not, and here we disagree with, it's not a question of having them signed. It's just that the numbers are not there. In my career in the fund, I worked on Somalia many years ago, before it collapsed. I worked on Mongolia, I worked on Haiti, I worked on the Dominican Republic. I'm talking about the neighbors who are much poorer. The numbers are available within 3 to 6 months. Maybe provisional numbers, but they are. And the evidence shows that clear numbers help in assessing and in improving the situation of the country. But having said that, I would say that the view of the government in terms of making the assessment of the economic situation of the island was too pessimistic. I also think that they did not do, and this is, I'm very surprised, there was no debt sustainability exercise made. There is, I have never seen. Maybe it was prepared, we prepared it, we made it available, and it showed that the debt could be sustainable with some effort. But let me go ahead. These were the central government accounts as we tried to put them together. I won't go into the numbers. If you're sleepless one of these days and at 3 o'clock in the morning you really want a good solution for the problem, you can go through these numbers. But fundamentally, let me see, okay. Here is the overall balance. This is the one we calculated with the measures. What the fiscal position would be, it would be a small deficit. There is an issue, the way the accounts are presented in Puerto Rico are a bit distorted because they put everything as part of the deficit, when there are issues of financing and there are issues of the deficit. Fundamentally, with the plan that was presented late last year, they could move to what everybody that deals with fiscal issues would consider is a small surplus. I think one could work further. One doesn't need to go into cutting education and all these things. One can work on these things. But fundamentally, the fiscal position, not the financing. And I agree with Jim, there is a serious issue of financing. But fundamentally, the underlying fiscal position of the island, of the government of the island, even with a declining population, even with a problem with GDP, is not a situation like you find today in Venezuela. It's certainly not Greece, and it is not Argentina. Argentina, I would say, has serious problems, but it has a problem of deficit that Puerto Rico, which I know is not a country, it's not a state, but it is closer to a country and to a Latin American country than any other institution that I have seen in recent times. Okay, I know I'm going over these things somewhat quickly, but let me tell you the following. This is, of course, available to all of you that are interested. In the international experience, the IMF found that a process of adjustment of maybe 1% of GDP was really something that could be done, and that would result in an improvement in the economic situation of the country, even without restructuring. I started from a position of no restructuring. Today we are in a different ballgame, although I have some problems about that. I'll try to mention those. We looked at 15 different countries all over, countries that are part of the European Union, so they have one single currency, the same as Puerto Rico, countries that went through a major process of adjustment, etc., etc. And what we found is, for different countries, that with a small adjustment in the fiscal balance, and I'm telling you, the numbers as we understand them show that Puerto Rico is not in a situation that is unbearable, you can have very quickly an improvement in GDP growth. I realize there are complications in terms of the dynamics of population growth, but fundamentally the evidence is that you can do a moderate adjustment, like Mrs. Kruger mentioned, like the governor in fact did, and like things we propose that would be very positive for growth. And the other important thing is that this is the NP spread. That is the spread of sovereigns over, say, the basic interest rate. When these countries make adjustments, they had a reduction in the premium that was bigger than the average for the equivalent countries. In a way, we're seeing this in Argentina today. It's a separate situation. But the evidence, I think, is that you can do these things. And here we come to some of these issues, and effectively, I won't go into all these things, but when we worked on this, and I'm convinced, I thought it was possible to come up with an agreement without restructuring. Today, I would say, with 18 or 19 different types of instruments, you have to sit down, and for certain companies, you have to restructure the issue. I won't go into the issue of bankruptcy, but for others, it will be very difficult. I heard what Jim said in terms of bankruptcy laws, but I think that the rule of law, which was one of the great things that Puerto Rico has and that you didn't find in Argentina, unfortunately, is one where you have to respect that, and if the path is followed of trying to restructure in what I feel is a unilateral way, that would end up in a situation with major lawsuits, because I don't believe that the Congress will agree to the type of bankruptcy law that is being sought, because they will think, and this is a fear, that states will come after Puerto Rico and ask for the same thing. There is no such thing as exceptional treatment, and this is a serious problem. So I would say that there is in the plan there is no clear sort of adjustment for the fact that if the position is to push for a restructuring, that there will not be actions, legal actions that will be very, very costly, not only for the island, the 30% of holdings in the island, but also in terms of Puerto Rican investors and foreign investors not bringing money in until the situation is solved. And for this, you need to really have a negotiation that is really comprehensive and not in what I perceive to be one-sided. I realize I am influenced by the Argentine experience, so you may want to eliminate that. But fundamentally, the message is that Puerto Rico can come up with a solution. Of course, restructuring some debts. I mean, the electricity company and others, they have to restructure because the company itself has problems, but it has to be done within, not the idea you restructure and then we'll see you restructure the company. This restructuring of the companies and the entities are the important things, not the restructuring of debt, although in some cases it's important. Okay. I won't go into all these things that I think could have been done differently, but I would say it is possible to come up with a program that does not have the gap that was mentioned by Jim, and where you could have a really much easier time with adjustment. And again, these are numbers that you may want to look at 5 o'clock in the morning if you cannot sleep well. But fundamentally, the one thing I wanted to show is the following. In my understanding, there was no debt sustainability done in the form that is done generally and approved by World Bank and an IMF. This is just an analysis. It is a glorified Excel workbook, so I will not try to oversell the product. But fundamentally, we did some work. I've been working on these things for quite some time, and I would say that even the program of the government, if it were done not in the radical way that I understand is being proposed, could see a reduction in the debt to GDP of the island, both in terms of the government fund, meaning the general government debt, and all of total public debt. So one thing, and with this I finish, one thing that I've been very surprised is that there hasn't been an analysis done of this type. Again, I stand to be corrected. And but fundamentally, in my understanding, you have Puerto Rico in a situation where a lot has been done, a lot has to continue to be done, and especially in the structural area, one has to sit down with the creditors. Now, I would say that a totally voluntary type of solution will not work, but one can work on something somewhat less sort of confrontational than what I perceive it to be now, and that Puerto Rico has all the elements as sort of a great potential place for what was mentioned before, the link between Latin America and the United States as a fantastic bridge with people with high human capital skills, and all that potential can be used, but it requires discipline and transparency to be to be helpful for the future of the island. Sorry to go beyond my analysis.
I'll be brief. Actually, I think that there are some issues with the terms, because at times we're talking about restructuring when I think that the problem is not the restructuring itself, but actually the haircuts, the impact to the principal that lies at the heart of the problem, because that is what impacts the investors. We represent 25 of the largest credit unions, and we have been presenting proposals. We are actively participating in the negotiations with the GDP. I think we are the only organized local group. So to some extent, our proposals do not end with the credit unions themselves. The credit unions do have present the sensitive issue of being part of the depository institution system of the island, where they carry particular regulatory and financial needs. But our concern goes over to the position of the other local investors. I'm glad to hear Jim indicate that the estimates of local holdings go to $15 million. That's very close to our own estimates, made out by Fernando Viñas of Ramirez & Company, which is the financial advisor to the G25, as we have been called. I think that our experience in the process of negotiations can be summed up with the latest proposal that has been announced. You know that last week we did close a transitional deal extending the terms of the May 1st maturities that was done mainly to protect the regulatory capital of the credit unions. That we understand that was a very good and very important step, but it's not a definitive solution. We have been discussing and participating with Milton companies and Clevie Gottlieb's team regarding an overall view of GDP, and an interim or a preliminary agreement has been announced as to the views of the ad hoc group of hedge funds. I think that experience is a good sample of what our divergent views are. And regarding that proposal, and I'll be just touching on some of the positions that have been taken by the G25 regarding that proposal. That was announced at midnight on May 1st, 2016. The GDP announced the preliminary terms of a possible agreement to restructure the bank's debt. The terms agreed to with a group of hedge funds that contemplate a bond exchange with a principal haircut of 47%. The GDP's press release points out that the proposal contemplates the issuance of other par value instruments, the specific terms of which have not been defined. The GDP's disclosure acknowledges that the bank's restructuring will require the consent of the entirety of the bank's bondholders, including the state-chartered credit unions, cooperativas. Additionally, it recognizes that the hedge funds ad hoc group represents only 25% of the GDP's debt. The terms disclosed by the GDP aiming to make principal haircuts correspond to the proposals and financial expectations of hedge funds, for whom said haircuts do not imply capital losses on account of them having acquired their bonds at a discount price in the secondary market. This is in contrast with the situation that traditional investors confront. Traditional investors, who typically bought their bonds at par in their original issuance, principal haircuts represent material losses, both of capital and of current income. This is the same situation that state-chartered credit unions share with the rest of the Puerto Rican bondholders and traditional investors in the United States. The G25's position on this matter has been clear. The restructuring of the bonds held by state-chartered credit unions and the other Puerto Rican investors cannot be subordinated nor be conditioned to the hedge fund's negotiation perspective. And second, debt reduction cannot be achieved blindly without acknowledging the full financial realities of each group of bondholders, especially those comprising a majority. Accordingly, for a hedge fund that acquired its bonds at the discount price in the secondary market, a reduction of principal is neither a losing transaction nor implies sacrifices of any sort. Depending on the moment of acquisition, the principal haircut can in fact translate into double-digit gains for these speculative investors. On the contrary, for traditional bondholders, these principal haircuts represent a loss of capital and a loss of current income. The proposed agreement contemplates that the undefined par value instruments, presumably to be received by the co-ops and local bondholders, should have a net present value equivalence to the hedge fund's discount instruments. However, said formula leaves out the true yield that the hedge funds receive on account of their discounted acquisition price. For example, to receive 53 cents in exchange for an investment bought perhaps at 35 cents represents a yield of 151%, which even if annualized over a period of 2 or 3 years, the time period during which many hedge funds have bought their Puerto Rico investments, would represent extraordinary double-digit yields. In order for traditional investors to receive a truly comparable transaction, the GDP would have to provide them, the traditional investors, with bonds that carry principal premiums and/or higher yields. As we can see, the alleged comparability of the GDP hedge funds agreement is not so comparable. A true equivalence requires that the calculation take into account the true yield that the hedge funds will receive based on the reduced principal amount invested upon acquiring bonds at a discounted price. The GDP and its advisors cannot disregard this financial reality. In view of the above, the G25's position regarding the agreement between the GDP and the hedge funds is as follows. The instruments that are offered as part of the restructuring have to acknowledge the financial reality of the actual capital truly invested by each bondholder. Willful blindness toward said financial reality is not admissible. Objections to implement this comprehensive and realistic calculation on account of alleged unworkability reveal an unwillingness to protect the capital of traditional investors both in Puerto Rico as well as in the US, and a tactical affinity in negotiations with hedge funds, leading to an alignment of interests between them and the government. By the same token, objections due to alleged conflicts with bankruptcy principles, which have never been fully presented to us, constitute an artifice, as the restructuring under negotiation is a voluntary process governed by the parties' freedom of contract. An agreement in good faith must be based on the interests of the majority of the bondholders, and not merely on the interests of that minority which facilitates fulfillment of the goal of debt reduction at any cost. An agreement with such a slim likelihood of real implementation and founded on the interests of a minority ends up being a simulation. Even if that simulation has the purpose of lobbying Congress for debt restructuring powers that allow imposition of principal haircuts, this exercise lessens the restructuring negotiations and unnecessarily delays them. With regards to the goal of reducing the amount of debt, we must express the following. GDP's interest in achieving debt reduction is evident. However, to the extent that said reduction impairs the capital of the Puerto Rican savers and investors, be them members of our state chartered credit unions or direct holders of Puerto Rico bonds, the social benefit of reducing government debt will be offset by the damage to our economy. The decapitalization that our economy would suffer due to the principal haircuts will impair our prospects for economic recovery, which is an essential precondition for a definitive solution to Puerto Rico's fiscal crisis. It is for this reason that the principal haircuts that the government proposals contemplate, which deliver the greatest damage upon Puerto Rico's investors, end up laying the foundation for the trauma of a future default. This risk of future financial failure is especially dangerous when we consider that debt restructuring is just one piece of a decisive solution, which requires first adopting economic development policies that lead to growth, thus increasing government revenues, and two, reform governmental structures and operations to ensure sustainable levels of spending and increase public productivity and efficiency. In the absence of policies addressing these two fundamental components, debt restructuring will only generate a mega transaction, the effects of which will be brief and insufficient, forcing us to repeat the process in the near future. Moreover, the principal haircuts and the prolonged legacy of a superbond, the curtailed capital of which will be a long-term reminder of the credit default, will be an impediment to Puerto Rico regaining credibility and market access. Finally, let it be clear that in our current circumstances, the many calls to debt reduction do not truly represent a détente to the speculative interests of the hedge funds. On the contrary, the government's desire to achieve debt reduction without acknowledging the different circumstances in which each bondholder acquired his or her bonds and without taking into account the material bond holdings of Puerto Ricans has created an unholy alliance between the Commonwealth and the hedge funds. Furthermore, this has opened the door for hedge funds and their business model finding their way into the U.S. municipal bond market, a market from which they had been absent until now. When the government calls for a debt cut, it forgets that 1/5 of said debt is in fact the accumulated savings of decades of work of thousands of fellow Puerto Rican citizens. Likewise, those who paradoxically call for a default and for a cutting of the debt as a defense of the national wealth are actually endangering a national capital that amounts to $13 billion, corrected now to $15 billion, and end up advancing the interests of the hedge funds. This reality cannot be ignored. The defense of the public interest, which is the essence of government officials' ministerial duty, demands the protection of that national capital. Public policy can neither be blind nor be rendered unarmed in light of the political, economic, social, and moral imperative of defending that national capital. In conformity with all of the above, the G25 reaffirms its commitment to advance proposals that protect the public interest, which includes granting the Commonwealth reasonable assistance to allow delivery of public services while protecting Puerto Rican wealth. We're convinced that said balance is both achievable and necessary. We maintain our continued discussions with the GTV to reach said goal. Thank you.
moderating. I think today's conference title is very telling and highly significant for Puerto Rico. Our circumstances today obligate the island to tackle fiscal, economic, and debt restructuring all at the same time. By the same token, though, what Puerto Rico does with each single component will affect the others, as well as the whole. And very paradoxically, the government's credibility is at the very center of it all. By way of background, for those of you who may not know what monoline insurance companies do, AMBAC, who I represent here today, is a leading monoline insurance company. Principal business of monolines is insuring municipal bonds to help provide states and municipalities with low-cost financing and access to capital markets. Monoline insurance companies have helped the government to access the markets, fund operations, and obtain critical infrastructure financing. AMBAC itself insures $2.2 billion net par municipal bonds in Puerto Rico, and those of us who live here and pretend to live a few more years here. It has been a leading voice in favor of sustainable long-term solutions that respect both the rights of creditors to be made whole and the importance of making the structural and fiscal reforms that will put Puerto Rico on a path to growth. These solutions will require that the Commonwealth restore its credibility and consequently access to capital markets. It is encouraging that the Governor supports a Federal Oversight Board, and we eagerly await the issuance of a revised Promesa bill next week. Unfortunately, recent events of default and moratoriums distract from the real and viable solutions, with the risk of seriously impairing the island's ability to raise capital, attract investment, and generate job and economic growth sustainably. Where we stand today, credibility and transparency are key. The Governor must lead to restore these immediately. Tone, manner, and actions need to be aligned. Good faith, open books, and relevant facts should all guide the discussions. The narrative cannot be selective or convenient to allege that Puerto Rico does not have the capacity to pay its debts, that the island's debt service ratio is a, quote, unsustainable 36%, that Puerto Rico has generated far more financial reports recently than at any time in history, or that the local government has severely cut expenses and can do no more. The public is inundated with information of this sort, but it is independently unverifiable and often contradicted by the government's own data. Solutions must be responsible, comprehensive, and sustainable. A responsible solution is one in which the government honors its financial obligations, implements meaningful fiscal reforms, and restores access to the markets. Structural reforms are key for the subject matter of today's conference in order to encourage private investment, create jobs, and grow the economy. As to a credible path forward, the solutions are many, but a few are what we call low-hanging fruit. Puerto Rico can immediately implement a number of initiatives that do not require legislation, restructuring, or Chapter 9, involve political risk, or require congressional action. First is improvement of tax collection. As we know, Puerto Rico has a mere 56% collection rate compared to a national average of 83, an improvement of a modest 65 to 70% collection rate would bring in $400 to $600 million in additional revenues without raising taxes. The second measure would be to implement efficient permit reform. Reforms can be achieved through executive orders from the Governor. This mechanism helped significantly in the development of energy projects between 2009 and 2011, unleashing about $1.2 billion in direct investment during that period. There are many public infrastructure assets to construct or upgrade, including sewage, bridges, ports, and solid waste facilities on the island. Permanent reform can conservatively unleash between $2 to $3 billion in new investment. Third, the reactivation of P3s, or undertaking meaningful privatization. Puerto Rico has a readily available P3 statute. It was used years back, 2 large transactions. It hasn't been used since 2013. We have assets like the Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority, PRASA, PRITCO, PBA, insurance corporations, ports authority, facilities from non-tax operations that are there and have potential for development through P3s or privatization measures. These transactions could yield anywhere from $2 to $4 billion conservatively in upfront payments, in addition to displacing CapEx investments and operation and maintenance costs away from the government and into the private sector. Fourth measure would be to implement government procurement reform. Existing 2011 legislation would ensure that these procurements are centralized, transparent, and leveraged in volume to realize significant savings. A mere 4 to 8% efficiency rate there, based on the most recent procurement data, would yield another $500 million to $1 billion in expense reductions. And fifth, by way of example, would be completing the PREPA revitalization. As has been mentioned before I took the microphone, this process is fairly advanced, and it is a good example of consensual negotiations that should help restructure a $9 billion debt stack. Anticipated energy infrastructure investments for new power plants and existing systems would conservatively hit the $1.5 to $2.5 billion investment range. These are only examples of actions that Puerto Rico should have taken long ago, but can start taking immediately on its own. Only then will the government begin regaining lost credibility with citizens, investors, and Washington, D.C. In closing, Puerto Rico finds itself in a very distinct and unenviable historical position. First ever defaults, first ever junk ratings, moratoriums, and this coincides with an election cycle of 2016, which, given the candidates, guarantees a change in administration in 2017. AMBAC supports an independent, federally appointed board that can help Puerto Rico's government make the necessary changes it has been unable or unwilling to make. It's important that such board be empowered, however, to examine every issuer and make the reforms that are needed, not just the ones that are expedient. The support for a robust, well-constituted, and appropriately empowered control board is underscored by plenty of good examples: Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, and New York City. Detroit's continued difficulties, on the other hand, speak to the shortcomings of a Chapter 9 type framework in creating long-term solutions. Given these variables and historical circumstances, a federal board seems imperative to help reinstate the credibility in the market and establish the structures needed to ensure reforms that actually enhance economic development. We look forward to working with the Oversight Board, if and once implemented, and hopefully the government of Puerto Rico, to achieve solutions that are both equitable to creditors and recognize the importance of positioning Puerto Rico and its residents for long-term stability and growth. These two goals are not just consistent with one another, but truly go hand in hand, considering the importance of restoring Puerto Rico's credibility, access to capital markets, and ensuring durable solutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Since Claudio and Mr. Sosa made specific comments, that since Dr. Lopez and Mr. Sosa Llorens made specific comments, I thought that maybe you would have a reaction. He said something in terms of the fiscal sustainability or announced debt analysis report.
I would add an unholy alliance. No, but that, why don't you comment?
I will. So there are debt sustainability analyses, which are the province of IMF economists, have been done. This is no. Oh, it's on. Is this it just turned back on? All right. So debt sustainability analyses have been done. They're embedded in the proven work. We've done one. The Treasury Department's done one. I'll tell you though that as much as you're interested in them, and Dr. Kruger's in, and I find them interesting, creditors are not the one to engage at this level other than through you, and you haven't been around for a while. So, and I agree, they're a useful analytical tool, and we've used them, and they're there, but I haven't had AMBAC call me and ask for it. And it's not that kind of thing that, or Jose Sosa called me and asked for it, they don't traffic in debt sustainability analysis. But I agree with you that, that the object of the game here is growth, and that fiscal reform, and Dr. Kruger lays this out, three-legged stool. Fiscal reform, structural reform, debt restructuring. All of that is, in her estimate, required to restart the island's growth. We can't debate individual numbers, but it's not the forum. I hope when you listen to Jose that you understand the difficulties that we face in brokering a deal among the various creditor factions. The entry point, is that what we call it? The entry point. Looking at what every creditor, at the basis they have in the debt, and fashioning haircuts around that is every par holder's dream of how it should work, so as to allocate the ability of a buyer in the secondary market to enforce the claim at par compensates them for the risk of actually buying a default or soon to be a defaulted security. A risk which is very hard to quantify. But if there's a willing seller of debt at a discount and a willing buyer of debt at a discount, to say to the buyer of the debt that's all you can get is not adequately compensating them for the risk of having purchased the debt in the middle of a restructuring. And the consequence of that, if the buyer can only enforce the claim to the extent of his purchase price, there would be no buyers. And therefore, the people who are benefited by having an active secondary market in the trading of distressed securities in bad behavior. Sometimes courts have exercised an equitable remedy to write the debt down to the purchase price of that the buyer acquired, the buyer who behaved badly. But I've only seen it once or twice actually in real life, in previous restructurings. As to our unholy alliance, I think we should get a couple of those hedge funds who we're allegedly allied with to come to the next forum, see if they think they're tightly bound to the government of Puerto Rico doing its bidding. I doubt that they will testify.
I think they would be surprised.
I think they would be surprised to hear that they're an unholy alliance.
Well, I think that it's important to put in perspective the idea of the point of entry approach, because since the outset we acknowledged the hedge fund's interest in making a buck. So since the outset we indicated that any offer to them should include a reasonable yield above what they acquired. In terms of the effect in the secondary market, well, we are killing the primary market because we are imposing major haircuts to those traditional investors that trusted the word of the Puerto Rico government. And we have no qualms in imposing a 47% haircut on them, but then we are a bit timid about asking the hedge funds not to have an extraordinary yield, but to have a reasonable one. Yeah. So I think that sound policy requires looking into new alternatives. Because in the end, hedge funds have not played a major role in the municipal market. Now they are looking into it because of this opportunity of making an extraordinary return on the backs of the other investors, not only here in Puerto Rico, but in the U.S.
Yeah, I think we're going to have to fashion, if we're doing this in a voluntary fashion, consent rules, which is all we have available to us right now, we're going to have to satisfy the legitimate expectations of each of the creditor constituencies, or they won't be doing it. So I think some of these principles may be taken into account in the creditor negotiations. We've made the point very clear. In many respects, in every restructuring, the borrower ends up being really more of a mediator between the competing creditors for a limited sum. We are in the role right now of mediating how the limited sum can be allocated against the main claim. And at a moment in time like this, a lot of adjustments are going to have to be made by both parties to their previous prerogatives and positions, and one hopes that consensus can be achieved. But I think it starts with a realistic assessment of the situation on the ground, and I think the current candidates, need to take a hard look at the fiscal situation not promise pie in the sky. I think it's time for tooth talking on both sides of the aisle.
Yeah, part of the reason I mentioned those, and I don't want to sound oversimplistic because I know it's not a simple situation. The reason those are listed there, and I've discussed this in Congress, I've discussed this here in different panels, professional organizations, is those already exist. We don't have to cross the aisle, we just have to execute, or can be implemented through executive order or administrative issuance.
Yeah.
So these are all literally, they're not even hanging fruit. These fruits have been on the ground and they're starting to rot.
Yeah, I don't want to be, like, I'm not a partisan in this.
I know.
But this is an incredibly partisan.
No, Jim, I'm stating these are facts. These
Okay,
are
I know,
laws that
but,
exist.
all right, so I'm gonna now just make sure there's a balanced view on this. So the PREPA restructuring has been commenced and a consensual process by this administration, not the previous administration. And it's well on its way.
I did not say otherwise.
Right. It's well on its way to completion. This administration is actually improving tax collection, and it actually has increased enforcement, and it is showing results, not under the last administration.
That is correct.
Okay, so
I didn't say
the permitting can be done, and it is been delayed. I agree with that. It needs to, that is an essential element in the FEGP. We laid it out as an important measure that needs to be implemented, and it should be done post-case. I agree with that.
I agree. Again, the fine print is important.
And
Permanent reform
let me just
had been
go back to
Yeah.
the P3, and the P3s, PREPA should be one of the big P3s coming down the road. The restructuring expressly contemplates a process by which bids will be solicited. There are a couple of other assets that are, you listed some of them are not really assets that can be P3'd. But clearly, there's a highway left to be P3'd, and that is on the agenda.
Agreed. And again, it's an issue of the facts. We had permanent reform. World Economic Forum, I think Frank mentioned at the beginning of the presentation of the conference that Puerto Rico has to increase its competitive advantage. Well, we're measured typically by World Economic Forum and the World Bank Group. And as of 2012, we had gained 50 positions in ease of doing business on island.
Yeah.
And we had good permanent reform for the first time in 25 years. That reform was reversed in 2013. And I'm glad Kruger mentioned it in her report, but those are the facts that can be implemented as easy as an executive order while we get legislation through our state legislature. So again, low-hanging fruit, the credibility factor of we have the tools we need to implement. We don't need congressional support on those scores. Those are another 20 bucks, as we say in good Spanish. But there is a lot that the government can do locally to regain credibility, to get our economy going, which is the main reason we're here discussing this today. And I think those are issues that, again, they're not partisan, so I did not, if you interpreted this as a partisan comment, I did not mean it, nor did I say it that way. These are facts, these are laws that exist, these are executive powers that the governor has, and he should not abdicate that. He should implement, for the benefit of all here present, our economy and the revenues that that is going to generate, which is what the government needs to make debt payments.
And the 20 bucks have been haircutted to 10.
Yeah, we no longer have 20 bucks to discuss
We're
it.
doing our job pretty easy. I do have a couple of questions. The first is for Jim, the second is for Jose. We've reported that Treasury officials asked the governor to default on GDP's debt, and that in fact, the Treasury has asked the governor to delay renegotiations in order to speed up the process in Congress. Is that true or not?
No.
Jose, you said that this situation is going to affect tremendously local voters. I wonder if it's the case why they don't organize and why they don't come up front and sit on the table if it's the case.
Well, it's not an easy process. To actually organize, you have to have technical resources and facilitate that organization. I think we're seeing that now. We hope that the steps taken by the trade unions, by the cooperativas, have fostered that process. And we look forward to having an exchange engage with them under the applicable legal constraints, because we work under the NDAs to participate in the negotiations, which I fully agree are necessary. We're dealing with securities here, and we have to have legal safeguards to guide the process. But I think that organization process will speed up, and hopefully it should assist in building up a consensus around the majority of bondholders, and that should speed up the process.
Yeah, one of the ones that you touched, I think it's coming again from our experience in Argentina, that we've seen already more than one restructure. Argentina, this one was the last one, the 2001 was the largest one and the biggest one, and everyone knew, but Argentina had many bond restructuring, and we have a long history, probably we're the most sophisticated in it.
I think Greece might be behind you.
So they're not Chileans sitting here, they're Argentinians. So to make the story short, I would imagine that, because in Argentina that happened, that you can do a financial reform, which effectively haircuts would be a financial reform, and effectively you're getting almost like a new loan and a new extended maturities and so on and so forth, or haircuts or whatever. But then, if the other piece is not done, you're back to square one.
Sure.
So I would imagine the concerns that Jorge pointed out, and I would imagine most of the people here in this audience would be also concerned, okay, let's imagine that we get the haircut, but nothing gets done, which as of now there is no more signals that the other part of the equation is being done. There is a 14 issue. So that's one concern. And the second concern, as you pointed out very clearly, is the white aisle. So as we're trying to sit down with bondholders on different sides, also should be important to have both sides of this white aisle to have basic agreements on, for example, on the electricity utility that's been here for many years. Every party says, oh, we need to do something, and almost nothing gets done until it's, the water is over their eyes. So there are 2 or 3 things that tax reform, how are we going to collect taxes, which is, the secretary said, I'm pretty inefficient, I don't have systems, I don't have data, I don't have databases, I don't know where to start. He's getting his low-hanging fruits to enforce. But if you don't also put the other part of the equation on the table, people are going to be concerned. Yeah, you did the financial side, but in 5 years we're going to be back here.
Okay, so let me address that, because so there's a bill in Congress, which may or may not pass, that has both elements. It has financial restructuring authority, and it has an oversight board to ensure fiscal discipline, transparency, and consistency across time and across administrations, because any observer here knows, one party comes in and they undo what the previous party did, and you're going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. There's been no policy consistency at all. If you got a bill out of Congress, you'll get both sides of it. You've got a strong one, you've got an oversight board with real power, and you've got financial restructuring authority. In the absence of that is sort of the PREPA model, which is how we have tried to address this issue, which is we have a restructuring agreement with the creditors, but embedded in the restructuring agreement is a required governance restructuring of the utility and a regulatory restructuring of the utility, and potentially an ownership restructuring of the assets of the utility. And it's embedded in the debt agreements with the creditors, and they're interconditional. So the debt relief will not come without the legislature doing a series of things required under the restructuring agreements with the creditors in order to reform the utility. Because what the creditors have said is, I'll do this, I'll make the sacrifices requested, but there has to be quid for the quo. I don't want to do this again, and so there has to be consistency in the way the utility is managed and operated and governed going forward that is enforceable, credible, and transparent. And so, we'll see. There are things required that we're moving down the road on getting the things that the creditor deal requires to be implemented from the legislature But, you know, it requires follow-through, we'll see.
And if I may, the nuance on the PREPA transaction, which I think is very commendable, is that when PREPA was almost out of petroleum and they needed a forbearance, they called a timeout. And the forbearing creditors said, fine, and we're going to put a structure on it, and that's the CRO. And that CRO has undertaken what Jim says is an operational review, a financial review, and a debt structure review, upon which creditors are now willing, conditionally, to put back money into it and try to put good money after a new good structure, not bad money after a bad structure. And if we extrapolate that, that's exactly what should happen at the Commonwealth level.
Right, so in the absence of federal legislation, I think that is the only path forward. But
Do you think that the Congress is going to act, and at the end, they're going to pass legislation before July 1st? So we're back to square one.
you know, I
Gladys wanted to make a comment after Gladys went across.
Yeah. I just want to comment on the issue of the concerns about a supervisory board that is sort of very much in the discussion, and it is the following. People say that the island will lose in terms of its autonomous or sovereign right if there is this commission or the supervisory board. And actually there are two experiences that would indicate otherwise. In Brazil, the federal government acted with regard to the finances of its states. I'm not talking about the Brazil of today, I'm talking about the Brazil of about 20 years ago, 15, when there was an issue about the finances of the states. And this worked very well to bring back the discipline while maintaining the autonomy of the government. In the other big example, although it's very controversial and it may sound like self-advertising, is the role of the IMF in the programs that take place, in the sense that it's not that the Congress or the government loses its power, it's just that there is somebody who has a certain degree of prestige, maybe controversial, looking at the particular
and
issue.
money.
Money.
And money.
That is true. That is
The
true.
golden rule.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
This board is not putting money.
But fundamentally, but it's a money, of course, that helps. Yeah. But the power of the federal government is almost equivalent to that. Although not
This is something that they touched barely, but I'm asking you because you have the role of doing that restructure. I agree on many of the things that you've said, and also what Jorge said, and there's a piece of truth in everyone. But the question is, you have the government saying we need to change things how we acted, and on the flip side, this is the things that I still don't understand. They're trying to relaunch, re-leveraging another utility with a securitization now, with the water company. So you're going to say on one hand, hey, I don't want to continue leveraging myself, instead of eventually raising $5 the water company to be sustainable over time.
Yeah.
So you do see this contradiction of, yes, here we're going to do the financial restructuring, we're going to suffer the pain, but things are going to change going forward. And at the same time, on the same newspaper, you read, hey, we still want to have a securitization, creating a new SPV that anyone can challenge afterwards. This SPV will work, and is it senior, is it junior? So the question is a contradictory news for everyone who's looking at Puerto Rico from a step back.
Yeah, so CASA has a capital expenditure need that is unavoidable, just in maintenance and operations and regulatory compliance. And obviously in this environment, it is, shall we say, ambitious to believe that they will actually raise new money until the overall situation is resolved. But as it stands today, the water rates are sufficiently debt service. The question is, what do you need to do in regard to this new financing? And the financing will be, one would guess, expensive in this circumstance. But
I'm saying it's more about the message, no?
no, I understand what the message is, but part of it is that the management team is trying to solve their problems and their immediate problems, and there's really what alternatives available to them. The government doesn't have a gap to fund it. So they have an immediate capital expenditure need. You know, they've got an investment bank saying we can sell bonds. You know, we'll see.
What happens with the global restructuring plan that you're pursuing if at the very end you don't get to an agreement with ad hoc or a GDP? What happens with the global? Given the recent statement that the government says that if you're not able to strike a deal with the ad hoc group and GDP, then the global restructuring you're pursuing won't come.
Well, no. I mean, the GDP creditors are a small, important group of creditors who have influence over the fate of the institution, which has ramifications around the island. So, look, you can't do what I do for a living without seeing the glass being half full all the time. So we have half a deal with the GDP ad hoc creditors, and I am optimistic that we're going to get to the other side of it.
But if it doesn't happen,
I don't know. There are lots of what ifs here, and if it doesn't happen, we'll probably have a different deal with them. Look, this is the fundamental. I've been doing this for 35 years, and the deals get done when the creditors and the debtors recognize that they have nowhere to go. They're stuck with each other. And they made a contract 10 years ago, 20 years ago, or 2 years ago, which cannot be performed in full and needs to be restructured. But the government of Puerto Rico is not going anywhere. The creditors who have claims against them are not going anywhere. And as I said, it feels to me like we have a recognition of the problem, and we're now working and have an active dialogue. It's always contentious. This isn't easy stuff, but we have good lines of communication. Sometimes people will call you and communicate through you and spread vicious rumors and gossip. But we put up with that, and we still move on.
always carrying the governor's briefcases.
I'm holding hands.